The sound department is involved primarily in the shooting and post-production stages. The sound design, or Foley work, is usually the recreation or outright manufacturing of sounds that will be dubbed into the finished product. This includes the dialogue. Typically, the dialogue is the only on-set audio that is used in the finished product. Even the footsteps are normally removed and new ones are added back in during the post-production phase. While the soundtrack is not the product of the sound designers, it serves a similar purpose, so I'm going to include a bit of it in this presentation. The soundtrack, in essence, is another way to inform the viewer audibly, but specifically through the medium of music. Nearly all ambient noise is created in post-production. This is sometimes called Foley work. This can range from things as simple as a dog or cat's claws tapping the ground as they walk across a wooden floor, or an alarm for an exit going off. It could be something as normal as rain hitting a car's windshield, or the sound of an airplane diving. Now, the sound you're hearing is not what a plane sounds like, despite what you may think. For decades, this sound has been used on screen, and almost always used in conjunction with the image of a plane plummeting towards the earth. But planes don't make this sound, so why is that? The sound we're hearing is from what is referred to as a Jericho horn, or a device that's used on specific German dive bombers from the Second World War. So if these sounds only came from these certain planes, why are they so commonly used for other planes? These sounds were used in many newsreels, and it became an easily accessible sound effect for many studios after the Second World War. The unnatural sound seems to naturally evoke the sound of something falling, because in reality that's what it is. So used in conjunction with a regular airplane, something that should never make this sound, it tells the viewer subconsciously that something is very wrong. This sound effect has been mostly unused in recent years, but recently there was a major film with the specific aircraft that did make this noise, that film being Dunkirk. For those who have seen it, will know that the sound in the movie isn't quite the same from what we usually hear. And the truth is simple. The sound that we hear in this movie is not the sound effect, but it's instead a recreation of the sound effect using a series of horns within a modified oil drum. This was done because the population has become so accustomed to the real recordings of the noise that to us it's just another sound effect. Even if it's used in the right context, it wouldn't feel quite right. So to try and induce the same type of fear that someone probably would have heard if they were actually being dived on by this plane, Nolan chose to create a slightly off version of it, something that feels unnatural to us, something where we expect it to sound differently, it makes us feel uncomfortable, and in conjunction with the characters being uncomfortable seeing the plane dive towards them, it's, in an odd way, the closest that we as an audience could actually feel to being dived on by these planes. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to put soundtracks into two categories, the blunt and the subtle. Blunt scores often swell or take the place of Foley, while subtle scores are intended to go by almost unnoticed by the viewer. Either approach can work in a film. It all depends on the approach that the director wishes to take. Some examples of more prominent blunt scores should be that of Braveheart, or in another Michael Mann film, Last of the Mohicans, while more subtle examples could be the assassination of Jesse James, or some films just outright don't use a score, like in No Country for Old Men. Michael Mann is mostly known for his obsession with being realistic and for his use of sound in films. While some of his films, such as Thief and Last of the Mohicans, are fairly conventional, Heat is his most well-known product, and is much less conventional. While looking for a composer to create a new and more experimental soundtrack, Mann chose Moby. I touched upon there being two general groups of soundtracks for a reason. Heat uses both, but primarily chooses to not use a score at all, much like No Country for Old Men, instead using the ambient noise to help place the viewer within the environments of the characters. The opening of the film exemplifies this perfectly. We open on a train entering a station. The music is setting the tone of the modern epic set within the urban maze of Los Angeles. As soon as we are introduced to De Niro's character, the music goes to the wayside while we are assaulted from all sides by a barrage of phones, talking, frantic paces, operating equipment, clanging of scalpels on trays, and the beeping of monitors. We hear so much, but in the end we can't pick out a single entity. And if you're paying attention to the cinematography, you can see that this is also done to us visually. This is all intentional. It shows the viewer that in the chaos of the hospital, a man in uniform easily able to walk past everyone into an ambulance and just steal it. It's not in just this scene, but in the following scenes. It's not just in this scene, but in the entirety of the cold open. Scene after scene, we see events like this, almost all playing out in the same manner, all up until they converge upon a certain armored car in an underpass in Los Angeles. The second scene I'd like to bring up is the bank robbery. While this scene has been dissected a million times, and everything that can be said has already been said, you can't talk about Heat and not discuss the bank robbery. For those who haven't seen the film, we see a group of criminals from the beginning of the film rob a bank. What we see might be the simplest, rawest depiction of a bank robbery in film. There are no grand stunts or pyrotechnics. They just walk in, get money, and walk out. The scene is one of the few where the soundtrack is used. It's incredibly subtle and simple. The repeating notes emulate a heartbeat, cueing us that what's going on is intense. We can tell that the dialogue is from the set by the echoes. As it drags on, they leave the building, one by one. Our hearts beat faster. Pacino and the police close in. Time is running out. The tension builds and the beats keep steady, waiting for the right moment to break. As the final man walks out with a wide grin on his face and the truck moves to reveal the cops, his grin disappears, and so does the score. And what we get is a sound that isn't familiar to most of the viewers. What we're hearing are gunshots, but not the gunshots that we are mostly used to. Like the majority of sounds in film, gunshots are almost always dubbed in. And in many instances, the specific gunshots used have a similar history to the Jericho horns. They're incredibly old and common. They've become so common that we have become completely numb to them, despite the fact that the sound is the product of a very real thing that's lethality can't be understated. So, how did man get the gunshots to sound like this? The answer is actually incredibly simple. What we are hearing is the actual on-set audio. The scene was shot in downtown LA, and the original plan was to use dubbed-in gunshots, but during the editing phase, man kept throwing out the cuts because, to him, they never sounded right. He eventually chose to simply use the raw audio they got on that day. Audio in scenes like this normally isn't used because the sound of raw gunshots normally isn't used in film because they are so incredibly loud. They drown out all the noise, and most importantly, the dialogue of the actors. The shots sound the way they do because of the location we're in. The blasts echo off every skyscraper down multiple blocks, add in several criminals with fully automatic rifles, and dozens of cops with pistols and shotguns, and a determined Al Pacino armed with a rifle. The resulting noise is one that is entirely unnatural, yet very real. The finale of the film takes a much more conventional approach. The music begins to bellow, and we hear a handful of gunshots. These ones are dubbed in. And as Pacino and De Niro have a final verbal confrontation, the music begins to swell.